Hi, happy Saturday. Do you see how pretty that sounds? All right, well, hi, my name is Ebony McLeod. I'm the programs manager here at Art and Practice. Before we get started, I just want to say thank you to our museum and residents here at Art and Practice, the California African American Museum. Can we give us some love for that? Has everybody been able to see the show yet that we just opened today? Yes? Yeah, does it, how are we feeling about it? It's good, right? Yeah, yes. Well, thank you so much for being here for the opening conversation. I'm going to speak quickly about our guest speakers. I'm going to step to the side, and then we're going to get started. Does that feel good? All right. Nicole R. Fleetwood is the Paulette Goddard Professor in the Department of Media, Culture, and Community, and the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis. A MacArthur Fellow, she is a writer, curator, and art critic interested in Black art and cultural history, aesthetics, photography, and documentary studies, and activism. LeRonn P. Brooks is an art historian and curator of the African American Art History Initiative at the Getty Research Institute, where he also leads the development of African American collections and acquisitions. Can we please give a warm round of applause for our speakers?
Hey, Nicole.
Hey, LeRonn. Can I just first say I'm so delighted with this beautiful crowd. It was great being in the gallery and watching people experience this archive for the first time. I was able to write to Alan Governor this morning, and he's the founder of the archive. He's an elder who's been at this work for over 3 decades, and he was so moved to hear that folks in LA are embracing this and that there's a younger generation engaging it. So I wanted to let you all know that, and also just wanted to thank Justin, Ebony, Alexandria, Leah, Paul, Mario, all the wonderful people I have met at Art and Practice. I have felt at home here, and thank you for welcoming me in. I was having coffee and making myself real comfortable earlier over the last couple of days. So it's been really great, and I'm super delighted that this show is going to be here for until September, and I hope that Black Angelinos can see themselves in these images of Black Texans.
Thank you, Nicole. No, I mean, again, thank you to the staff because you've been working really, really hard on this, on top of the things you do every day. And so I'm just really happy to be working with you and really proud of your work. And thank you for everyone to come on this Saturday, the weekend, for this conversation because it actually does mean a lot that you do show up, that you, I've been in LA for about 7 years, you do disrupt your peace. You get on to get somewhere in the weekend, and I don't take that lightly, so thank you very much. And I hope you get a lot from this conversation, as we do. Yep. So I just want to begin with a paragraph of Nicole's writing from the catalog, and it is an amazing catalog, and Nicole is a terrific, terrific writer, and she doesn't waste words, she gets right to it, and for me, this is like a sort of a great way to begin. How many people have seen the show? Okay, so maybe we can begin here since you have witnessed the show, right? And by TAP, T-A, the Texas African American Photography Archive. The TAP collection demonstrates what happens when we shift our attention away from the exceptional moments of Black American life, most often highlighted in the national media. Slow down and pay attention to the local and regional scenes where Black people build livelihoods, neighborhoods, and intergenerational networks of belonging. They do so despite the persistence of anti-Blackness as beautifully told by the Fort Worth-based photographer Calvin Littlejohn in his oral history interview with Governor. Littlejohn tells the story of his grandfather homesteading in Arkansas, raising his family and accumulating a degree of wealth and land ownership against the systematic disenfranchisement he experienced there. Then after his grandfather was injured, Littlejohn was forced to manage the affairs It was incumbent on me at 14 to take the entire welfare of the family over because his boys were gone. That's where I got my business experience. I had to go and sell a little cotton. And I had to make the deal for borrowing the money and putting the hay up and everything. For me, this encapsulates the idea of the kinds of people we're talking about. You know, our ancestors, our fathers, our mothers, our grandmothers, our great-grandmothers, and so on, who in this particular East Texas community, but it's our communities, all of where we come from. My parents were from Alabama, you know, Nicole, Texas, right? The idea that even this young man who had to take so much responsibility is worthy of being seen in photography. The idea of the local. The idea of these aren't necessarily the iconic figures and not necessarily Martin Luther King or, you know, the civil rights movement, but there is something to be said about our communities and everyday people and the work. And I think Nicole has done an amazing job with this exhibition in terms of really putting in front of us who really deserve to be seen. How'd this start, Nicole?
Thank you. Thank you for engaging with the work, LeRonn. So I enjoy starting small and telling bigger stories from something small. My last book was on art and mass incarceration, and it became kind of national and international, but it actually started with a set of very intimate images of incarcerated loved ones. And with this archive here, I also wanted to small, given that the archive itself is over 60,000 images from the 1870s until the current period of black photographers. There's about 27 photographers in the archive, and it started as what I want to say is that black Texans were engaging with photography from almost as early as photography existed. Photography came into existence in the mid-19th century. We can date images from the 1870s in archive, and there's probably images earlier than that at some point existed, but they were devalued. All of the works in this archive in some ways were devalued. In a way, the way I want to frame it is that Alan Governor, who is a white documentarian who spent many decades documenting black culture in Texas, was committed to kind of rewriting history, photographic history in Texas to make sure that black photographers were included. And he did that because during one of the big celebrations of kind of markers of Texas history, state legislature had publishers put together a book on the history of Texas photography, and there was not one black photographer in there. And when Alan Governor asked about that, they actually said, well, black photographers didn't exist historically in Texas. So he made it his mission to he spent literally 3 decades doing research, going around, driving around rural Texas to interview those who were still alive. Some of them were in their 80s and 90s. Some of them were survived by widows or by children. He tells this one story of, he also documents this, kind of beautiful story of black women in the history of photography in Texas. Many women were actually doing the developing and printing work, and that in itself shows not only a gender bias, but also the risk that black women were taking to develop photography, because we now know how toxic it is to develop traditionally photography. But he was showing in all these places doing these interviews, and one example is he came across this really wonderful photographer, a black woman named Elnora Frazier, and he showed up 3 days after she had thrown out her entire archive, because she said, I thought everyone thought that was junk. No one has asked me about this in decades. And so he did even more his mission to go around and, to build relationships, but also not to just archive their work, but to record oral history. So if you Google Documentary Arts Dallas, you will find yourself at the website, and it's not the most polished website, but it's a trove where you can actually access interviews with the photographers who were still alive when he came upon them, and they're telling you these incredible stories, like the Little John that you quoted. Little John, he was 14 and had to figure out his grandfather was hit by a horse, and he had to figure out like how to keep his grandfather's farm going. But he also said he was in town and he was at a picture show and he saw somebody with a camera taking a picture, and he's like, I got to figure out what that's about. And that's how he started. And he was like the only black photographer within a whole, like a kind of this big region. And he just for decades kept taking pictures. So I want to say I do like to start small, because I think the smaller we get, the more granular, the bigger the stories that we can tell. One incredible story to me is A.C. Till, who was a photographer in the 3rd Ward, and he ran a school for black photographers starting in the 1920s. This is in Houston, in the 3rd and 5th Wards, which are the historic black communities, where he taught many generations of black photographers out of his home with his wife, not only how to take pictures, but also to develop. His wife was behind developing. She was training other women in developing. She was also mentoring them, and like just the kind of gender precarity of a woman in that field, being out with the camera. And what they built in their home became the basis of creating the Department of Photography at Texas Southern University when it became an HBCU. They literally took that school from their home and created the first black photography department at HBCU in the state of Texas.
The fragility of memory, right? I'm still stuck on this idea of someone having this material for so long, and then 3 days before governor visits, they're gone, right? That idea. In my work I deal with memory and archives and things, and so...
Well, tell them about the archive that you recently helped secure. I think that's an incredible archive.
Ebony Jet?
Yes.
Okay,
all of the how many images?
4.5 million.
From the entire archive of Ebony and Jet.
Okay.
And I mean, just to talk about the importance of us actually being able to, because it went bankrupt, right? And it going to go into like commercial hands where those images were going to be used for all kinds of intentions they were not initially meant, right?
So in my work, I work at a research lab, at the Getty's Research Library. And so I'm founding the collection of African American artist archives. And what I do is that I go to sites of families, attorneys, anyone in possession of archive that I consider that I'm thinking about saving. Basically, I flew out to Chicago in 2008 when paywalls, right? 2008 when paywall showed up on the internet. You say, I get my news through this paywall. Magazines began folding because it was like, okay, well, how do you transfer to the internet? And the Johnson Publishing Company, Ebony Jet, they fell under the same thing. How do you transfer, right? So they're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars every month in paper for every particular magazine but in that transition, they went bankrupt. So what happens to that archive? Well, there it is. And so basically I worked with the bankruptcy attorneys in this particular case to get it to the archive, to research it, to then put it before the Getty, then the Getty to the Ford, and then the Mellon to the Mather foundations to eventually acquire the archive. Now it's the NIMOC, Museum of African American History in D.C., and the Getty Research Institute are stewarding the archive and processing 4.5 million images from Ebony Jet. Every iconic picture and the context sheets around those pictures, from Emmett Till to, it's not just those pictures, right, but it's context of Mamie Till. And so basically the fragility of memory. I go into storage facilities where people say, well, that's my auntie and she was the painter, but I'm paying $500 a month for U-Haul storage and I can't do that anymore. 3 storage rooms are gone. I see this one standing and I say, well, let me go through each one to E.J. Montgomery, the curator, right? E.J. Montgomery. And so the fragility of memory in terms of what we choose to keep and what we can keep and what gets lost because of gentrification, because of natural disasters, Katrina. And so when you hear something like this and that this archive actually exists, this massive archive of Texas history that's being saved by the groundwork, but not just the groundwork, the exhibitions that actually put it out there to people to say that this is a valuable history that exists and empowers people. So, you know, it's what do we do with those particular kinds of materials that we may have, but yeah.
And I think, you know, we have these kind of large archives. Everyone has heard of Ebony and Jet, but we also have all these regional community archives that sometimes we take for granted, or we think that they're not important. And, you know, really, and students will ask me, well, how do you do this work, blah, blah. And I say, you know, it's really important. You know, start with your own elders and kind of record keeping, interview them, do oral histories, go through their photo albums, digitize those albums, you know. I think it's very, very important that we continue to grow these materials. Why? Because the reason we're talking about archives and people know what we mean by archives, I mean, now people are like, I got an email from my favorite designer saying, oh, we're having an archive sale. When do fashion designers start? Like, archive now is we use that in, like, popular culture. But when I was in undergrad, it was still like, it's like, what's the archive? You have to go to the library and you have to get permission and you have to wear gloves to touch certain things, right? And we have really done a lot of work to democratize the archives, in part because of our elder scholars who have fought to make sure that black folks, that indigenous folks, that non-white immigrants are represented in historic records. You know, a really brutal, well-known saying is that the winners write history. And, you know, I think there's a lot of people who are intervening in those ideas to kind of understand there are multiple histories. My work is also about, like, looking at an image or looking at an archive and not walking away with one kind of normative idea about that story, but being able to also to read the image quite differently, to read it relationally, to read it through the youngest people in the image. So if you go to this exhibition, you'll see there are a lot of images of young people teaching each other, because the way that we really learn is through our peers at whatever age we are. We learn more from people. We model the people who are most like us. And so I think, you know, going back and thinking about those other kind of forms of knowledge that we can read into these documents are really important. I learned a lot. I'm from Ohio. My mom is here. She's from Houston. She lives in Houston, and now I spend a lot of time in Houston. But I'm originally from Ohio, and, you know, going through many thousands. I have not looked at all 60,000 images in this archive, but I have looked at thousands of them, and it has just complicated my understanding of Texas, a place that I've been spending time in since the 80s. And one is that I didn't know until I was doing this research that the earliest black folks in Texas were in the 1500s. They came up to what we now call Mexico, as part of, like, with the Spaniards, as part of, you know, so that, like, the presence of blackness in Texas, white nativists have written Texas as this, like, white ranchero kind of place, when the idea of ranchero is actually a Mexican concept. That Texas in the 1600s and the 1700s was actually a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious society. There were various indigenous groups there. There were Spaniards there. There were free Africans who were there, who were also part of, like, groups who were discovering and part of. And this is before slavery enters what the area we now know as Texas. Another thing I think is important for us, and, you know, I am not a part of the Beehive, but I am a great admirer of Beyonce, the thinker and the creator, because I think Beyonce has really helped to complicate how we see and understand Black Texas. One thing, people rarely know this. Okay, if you know the answer, you cannot raise your hand. When you think of the most populous states in the United States where Black people exist, where would you rank Texas in that? I'm just curious. Like, where do you? Third, you said third or fourth? Anybody else? Why are you saying third or fourth? Have you spent time in Texas?
I'm just thinking about other places that seem to be more.
Okay. I only ask because I think people think that there's not a lot of black people in Texas, except for like Houston or something like this. In the yellow sweater, yellow sweatshirt. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah. Black people are still more congregated around big cities. Yeah. Yeah. So where would you think of a state like Texas? Uh, it's only Chicago. Well, I say all this now because Texas is number one. There's more black people numerically in the state of Texas than any other. It has outgrown Florida, California, and New York, which historically have been the three. Texas is now number one. This is not statistically with the population, but numerically. And more black people are moving to Texas every year. Texas is a growing population. The cities of Texas are booming, and Houston has like an enormous black population, and it's also the multiplicity of black folks. Like Houston's black folks are from all over the world, literally, right? There are black Americans who are descendants of U.S. slavery, but there are also various West Africans, there are East Africans, there are black folks from the Gulf states, from the Caribbean, and so I think I think it's really important for us to understand Texas also in this political moment because Texas has so many electoral votes. Texas is a state of incredible disenfranchisement, the kind of remapping and redistricting, but the numbers are actually there. Like the numbers are growing meaning growing in ways that really could shift the kind of political spectrum that we're living through. Uh-huh.
Yeah. So black people only had possession of our bodies. Legal possession. Spiritually, but legal. And then one of the first things we do is take image making, right? Legally. Well, even before that, but close to the 1860s, we take up image making. Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, we cover the iconic images, right? But communities, people teaching each other. People tend to prioritize schools. Tell me what college James Baldwin went to, right? You didn't. And so it's just peer to peer. This idea of learning from each other, right? For him, secondhand bookstores, groups and reading, other writers. For these folks in East Texas, peer-to-peer, learning the difficulty, because, old school photography with film and develop that, it takes very specific, it's chemistry.
It's scientific, and yet it's very technical. You have to be really patient.
That's right.
And it's expensive. The other thing is it was also extremely expensive,
The camera itself, buying apparatus. And so the power of self-imaging, the power of, my grandfather and grandmother, Eastern Star, right, documenting that. Right, documenting that in community life, and you write about this, like the power of that, right? Could you speak about that?
Yeah, so one of the things that I just love about this archive is that you see in the thousands of images I've seen, it's really clear that these folks are not posing for a white gaze. Like the images are looking inward. The photographer is known by the community. They are looking at each other. The images are circulating inward, and by inward I don't mean backward. By inward I mean that they're going deeper in the relationships that they have in community. It's quite self-referential. There's kind of a knowingness of what they're doing, and then I, as a black descendant, right, I can look in and I can there's associations that I can make around, for example, there's a lot of symbolic images at a dining table. And that is highly significant because you're talking about people who are living during apartheid. So this is during segregation also looks different in Texas. Racism looks and feels different in Texas. Lynching is quite common, and other forms of vigilante injustice that takes place in Texas is very different than what it looks like in Alabama and Mississippi. Sugarland, a now affluent community outside of Houston, gets its name because of sugar plantations, and also because of the kind of forced prison labor of of people during Jim Crow era where many people were buried on those plantations. They've recently, in the past few years, uncovered a grave where people were literally worked to death, right? So it's really important to understand that the civil rights era looked different in Texas, partly, again, because of the history of vigilante violence in Texas, and the kind of romanticization of that, like the whole idea of the shootout and the cowboy. It's romanticizing outlaw and violence, right? Is the kind of romanticization of that. But it also looks different because the history of the Buffalo Cowboys, and who they were black. That part of the way they had their kind of conditional freedom was actually working for the U.S. to eradicate indigenous people, right? So it's this precarious relationship that they have to freedom. Raheem Fortune, whose work is also a part of this, the two shared exhibitions. Raheem Fortune is a black indigenous person from Texas and Oklahoma who does color work in the exhibition that's in response to the archive. He has a book called Hardtack, and that's about it's an homage to the Buffalo Soldier who survived on something called hardtack. Has anyone heard of hardtack? So they would be out in wilderness, West Texas, arid, no access to food, and they would have flour, salt, and water, and that's what they would survive on, and they would call it hardtack. So kind of thinking also about the histories of black survivalhood and really, really tough terrain that is Texas. There's also just some ways of thinking about how the civil rights movement looks different in rural Texas, where there might be a community of 200 people living 50 miles away from another town, right? And so you see these kind of organized protests where there's only 10 people in a room, right? And that civil rights change happened that way through the big marches of hundreds of thousands of people. Those were epic things that happened once in someone's lifetime. It was the everyday showing up that really changed these laws and changed society.
Nicole, so in my work, I run into a lot of different kinds of collectors. And in your essay, you mentioned vernacular photography, and then there's community photography. I have had I have met collectors of African American vernacular photography. They don't often look like us, but in these particular conversations, they are buying and selling things from lost family albums, right? And so they are selling images of men. I saw a whole line of black men in the military, and their daughter. I saw a photograph, and the proud men. This had to be from the 1950s, but it had no home. And they were selling these things individually, and I said, there's a wild world out there where people are collecting our images that we've lost. Gentrification, displacement, your cousin who took the family album from grandma, and you can't find the cousin, but it ends up, right, somewhere.
On the street.
On the streets.
Yeah. Because a lot of times people pick these things out of other people's trash.
That's right.
I mean, that's like literally, there is a group I work with in New York, Stephen Fullwood, who was an archivist at the Schomburg. If you're ever in New York, go to the Schomburg Center. It's the largest collection of materials on black culture in the world. It's like incredible. James Baldwin papers, they're Malcolm X, and you can get access to these things. But Stephen Fullwood, he was an archivist there for 20 years, and now he with his friend Miranda Mims, runs something called the Nomadic Archivist Project. And the idea is that you can be unhoused, and there's still a way that you can have ownership of your goods, and also that you can think about your legacy. Like, they want people, so they're working with people in prison, for example. How do you have control over your legacy when you're a ward of the state, right? And so thinking, and this really disrupts this idea that collecting belongs to the people with money, people with power, people with resources and recognition, that we all, and to me it's about self-agency also, like, and that we can also have a say in how we want to be remembered. You know, we should think about this. That I think part of what it means, if all the sacrifices that our ancestors have made still feel precarious because we're still fighting for voting and we're still fighting for safe housing, and we're still we can have 3 degrees and you're still paid an entry-level salary compared to white people, right? That is so infuriating. But one thing we can have is a sense of self-sovereignty and how we want to be in the world. What are the papers we want to, like that, how we want to, you know, what are our receipts? I did a book history talk at Hunter College, and it was called We Have the Receipts. Because black women know how to keep the receipts. Like, I tell you, my grandma used to have a purse full of receipts. My mom probably got a purse full of receipts. But it's because we always wanted, if someone ever questioned us about, did you buy this thing? You know, we had but that sense of integrity should also be into how we think, what we want to leave behind. You know, we're never too young to think about that, and that is not an arrogant thought at all. That is really a loving thought about how you want the people who will inherit whatever, you know, they're your inheritance, right? How you want, what you want to offer to them.
So, having seen the exhibition, for me, what gets me is the intimacy of it. That in, I believe, 1969, the Metropolitan Museum had a show called, you know, Harlem on Mine. And that's where people found, or first came into contact with James Van Der Zee. But they blew the picture up so big, right? You know, it was like a wall image that really undercut the work, because it's about intimacy. When you see these small photographs, the body-to-body relationship, you see it right there, and it becomes this jewel. You're close to it. And so walking around the exhibition, the intimacy of it, it pulls you into the life, but it also gives you a perspective. The photographer thought that was important to document. Now, as the curator of the exhibition, like how did you see the narrative form in terms of how you placed it?
Yeah, I mean, there was so much. Like, it was kind of overwhelming to think about, like, all the images. And so it actually started, this is how the curatorial project started, actually. I was invited, so this is a multiple collaboration of many organizations. Aperture Foundation, which publishes photography books, beautiful photography books, and I've worked with them before on a project called Prison Nation that I did in 2018, so I had a relationship with them. Documentary Arts in Dallas, where this archive is housed, and then a Center for Photography in Woodstock, which is upstate New York. All 3 of them were figuring out, like, how can we honor this work? Alan Governor's been self-publishing and kind of doing small regional exhibitions, but that's not necessarily his forte. So this was kind of an effort. And so they asked me to write an essay, because I've written about vernacular photography. And for those of you who don't know what that means, sounds like it's really everyday photographs. It's the images you have on your cell phone. It's the images that are not usually meant for museums, that are not meant for public consumption. They're private, everyday images of your favorite meal, of your, you know, mom, of your reading group, of all the things that you want to record and that feels very intimate to you. And so that, for the history of photography, most of that has been how people use photography, but it's not what what art critics write about. And so it's kind of like, in the past few decades, it's like, why aren't we writing about the way that we actually use photography in our everyday life? And so they asked me to write about this archive as someone who studies vernacular photography. And then they're like, oh, actually, can you co-edit the catalog? And so the catalog's downstairs. We're going to signing, and we're selling them afterwards if you're interested. But then as we're putting the catalog together, and we chose 150 images, Brian and I, well, this deserves its own wall space. So the curation actually came out of actually putting together a catalog, which actually started with me just writing 2,000 words, and now it's a traveling exhibition. And so I tell my students, always show up. Always show up. Someone might ask you a question, and that can grow into an entire career, right? So always just show up. Show up for the things that matter to you. And so that's how I'm here, because I was asked to write an essay 2 years ago, and it's turned into me now working on something, traveling. And a black curator from Dallas was at a signing in New York last week with him and me, and he was like, I have space in Dallas. You have to bring this, like, he's in Dallas. Black folks in Dallas are not seeing this work, and it's housed in Dallas. Right? So that's also like, so I want to say the part of it is like having your own intimacy with like, how do you curate an intimate show? Well, you have to create your own intimacy and kind of relationship to it. And for me, again, it's not transactional. And then honoring what I was seeing happening in the images where, for example, the photographers are photographing, there's a lot of images of the photographers photographing themselves. Because black people are professionalizing into a field that they had never had access to as a photographer. That's remarkable. In the 1920s Texas, it was like a young black woman, 25, becoming a photographer. That's now like a black person becoming cardiologist. It was quite, it was a rare feat. And so there's a lot of images of them photographing themselves. So that was important for us to capture their own self-awareness of how they were intervening, not only like aesthetically, but also in history-making. And when someone photographs you, you feel recognized. If it's a beloved photographing you, you feel recognized. So they're loving their community through the camera, when the history of image making of black people has been to derogate us, right? And so to really take this equipment and to really use it as a radical form of beloved community. And so I see that, and I wanted to honor what I see in those images, and for me to, if anything, to have a reverential relationship to these images, right? That they are reverential.
I think we'll open up for questions. Yep. So, any questions?
So we have about 10 minutes, 15 minutes, I think, for questions, and then we'll go downstairs if you're interested. Catalog, we have catalogs downstairs. But I would also like to plug that on May 12th, Raheem Fortune will be here talking about, and I think there's going to be music activation. He's a photographer, but he's gotten into also black country music, and so he's been making music. He'll be here for a program on May 12th. This is my cousin, by the way. I love Miles. He lives here in LA.
Out of all the images you guys have seen, what was your favorite?
So I almost always resist, even if I have favorites, I always resist saying that because I'm like, I don't want to create a hierarchy, but the cover of the catalog is one of my most cherished images, and it's of again, peer learning. It's a group of girls. They're all dressed alike. It's formally such a beautiful image, too. It's a black and white image of a group of girls doing a hand clapping game. And you can look and see them, but then on the end, you realize it's these two boys who also participating. They're bookmarking the girls in unison. And formally, the whiteness of their shirts kind of blend in with the white background. Like, there's just a lot that's formally happening in terms of the composition of that image. Hand clapping games, a lot of black feminist scholars are now writing about how black girlhood and how black girls learn through hand clapping games. I mean, not only rhythm, but they learn sociality, and they also learn things about like gender equity and safe sex, and think about all the kind of hand clapping games where there's all these kind of references to like adult things that we're learning about, right? And so I love peer learning among young people because I think it is how we become socialized for adulting.
I was just commenting because it's like synchronicity. You're talking about hand clapping. This song I discovered like 5 years ago. I don't know if this is or not, but it's very subtle. Sorry. There's this song, this incredibly song that I do everything, so I love music. It's Shirley Ellis. It's called the Hand Clap Song, and you get that song. I don't really DJ, but I do DJ, if that makes sense. It will get people on the floor because it's just an incredibly, like, it's what you're talking about, the energy of the song. So go find that song, you'll love it.
I may have heard it. Now I'm going to listen to it when I'm
But it was a
back
hit
in,
as
when I'm
well.
back
It was
in
a
the car.
national hit, but it's been forgotten like many things in black media,
Yeah.
not just
I'll
photography.
have to listen to it.
But I'll shut up.
There's another that I want to reference because it's another theme that's really important to me, and it's just great. It's also formal. It's so gorgeous. It's by Benny Joseph, who was photographed in Houston, like for Texas Southern University, for Texas A&M, for a lot of the parades and black celebrities and civic events, but he also did a lot of commercial photography for what I call a black media infrastructure. So we're talking, again, a time of segregation where black people don't have access to dominant media, where they're not showing up on TV, and if they are, it's very like a negative story on the news, right? But they're not showing up as anchors. They're not on mainstream radios as DJs, and so black people are creating their own media outlets. So the black press is very important. All of these photographers, I want to say almost all of them, their work is circulating in the black press. So they're photographing an event at the YMCA because they live in that community, and that photograph might show up in the black press. It might show up in someone's church newspaper. It might show up in some fraternal organization. So there's this thing about copywriting. It's about how these images are circulating and creating what a scholar, Dick Anderson, says as imagined community. You can't see all the black folks across Texas, but you are creating community between the urban and the rural, and know that other people are looking at, also imagining who's looking at their images, right? So there's one of KCOH, and they, Ebony, it may have been you or somebody said, oh, they were podcasting before we were podcasting, and what it was is a black radio station, a black-owned radio station created in segregated Houston that had a mobile, and they would drive around rural Texas, and they would broadcast locally. And these are places that wouldn't otherwise have had access to black radio. And so it's a gorgeous photograph of the mobile, this like big white bus with KCOH, and it's a whole black world, interior world that you see in this exterior image. Everyone's in it is black, the ads are black, the emblems are created by black people, and so there is a kind of wonder that it's what we call it the beautiful and the terrible of segregated life, is that because outside of that community was so horrific and so much spectacular violence could happen to you if you didn't get back home before the sun set, right? People were so intentional about being deliberate and creating beauty and taking care of children and communicating with each other within that community.
Said earlier that lynching was different in Texas than, did you reference all that with the Buffalo Soldiers and all of that, or was there
I'm just
something-
saying that Texas has a particular history of vigilante violence.
Okay.
And lynching is one example.
Yeah,
I mean,
okay.
Texas is a state that romanticizes its history of outlaw culture
okay.
and of vigilantism, and it is a state now where people still walk around strapped. In
Yeah.
2026, you don't
Right.
want to have road rage in Texas, in
Right.
Houston especially. You do not want. It's not going to go
Gotcha.
down like it might go down in LA or New York. I mean, people. So there's still this kind of romanticism. Last time I was in Houston for Easter, it was a road rage situation where a woman put out on a man, and then she ended up dead, and her kids are in the car. That's still the history of. It's an everyday kind of, and so, but that is rooted in a very
You're saying, okay, I see.
very early history, and it's an early history of fighting. My sister-in-law is Mexican American, and I remember asking her grandmother, when did you all come to Texas? And she said, what do you mean when we come to Texas?
It became, right, part of the United
The U.S.
States.
came to them,
Yeah.
right? Like she was, it was like also that kind of violence,
Yeah.
that border violence, very, very intense then.
And I
It
have
reminds
one
me
other
of like
question.
within our gates. It reminds me of like within our Gates Oscar show. So as you're saying, makes the protection of the community, the recording of the community, but also the ways in which we have to hold dear these boundaries we have, or this border we have outside of the world. Because if you come in the community, we have those things too, right? We have those things too. And so just thinking about just the atmosphere, and what makes the intimacy is also great boundary from the outside against the outside world.
I just wanted to ask one other thing. Is there also, in addition to photography, the video as well? Like I know you said the governor has those videos of interviewing those people, but also capturing as much of what exists of video,
So there's one excerpt that's in the exhibition. When you first walk in, there's a little room off before you enter the main gallery. And so that is an example of the kind of video documentation that's...
I know earlier you talked, the democratization archives, and I had a question about how do we do that institutionally on the level of like workers, but also as patrons.
On the level of workers
and patrons.
I mean, I think it's creating institutions, collecting locally, and offering that collection to institutions. One example is some activists we know who run an organization called Prison Watch Program, and it's out of Newark, New Jersey, and they've been documenting since the 60s the conditions of people in solitary confinement, maximum security prisons. They've been writing folks for 5 decades, and when we went to help them archive that work, we're shredding those letters. Because they're like, we don't have enough space for this. We didn't know anyone would, and so we got them to stop shredding stuff, but they had already shredded decades of stuff, and we were able to connect them with the Newark Public Library to have those materials housed there. So it is, one, it's a kind of educating people to recognize what might feel like junk to them because they don't feel like they can house it, could actually be very important to future generations.
You know that the processing of an archive is very expensive, and you need like a lot of talent to people who know what they're doing. But ultimately, it is public access. For my work, it is the public will have access to everything that I bring in. Researchers, school kids will have public access at no fee, right? And NELs, meaning that you can publish any image, right? As long as you're not making money from it, for a journal, for a paper, you can publish it in that thing. And so the institution provided the resources, provided the right integrity, institutional integrity, and providing it to the public once it's done. What you see in the reading room, every time I go to a storage facility and then I see ultimately the thing in the reading room so clean, it's been through conservation, it's been through so many levels to get to the researcher, but that's what it's about. That's what it's about, to get to the researcher.
Thank you.
Hello. I didn't really have questions, just wanted to say thank you for curating the exhibition. I'm from Austin, Texas, born and raised. I just moved to LA about 2.5 months ago, and I was a little homesick. And so standing in the back room earlier today and seeing images from Austin and Hutto and Round Rock and Prairie View, where my grandmother went to school, and Dallas and Houston, where my family, was just really grounding. And so I want to thank you for bringing a little bit of home to LA. Really appreciated that. My second point, which is something you brought up a few minutes ago, was about capturing joy in spaces in Texas where you could step outside the city limits and experience a lot of violence. Seeing images from Jasper, Texas, seeing joy was really important for me because growing up, still to this day in 2026, you don't stop in East Texas if you're Black. You keep driving through East Texas till you get to Louisiana or wherever you're going. And so growing up, we knew that Jasper, Texas was somewhere you don't go, and still you don't go, but there's still Black people that exist because they made home there, post-slavery, and they made joy and they made livelihoods there. And so seeing that joy was just a reminder that, we're going to create joy anywhere we go. And it was just really beautiful to see this and made me a little emotional. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you.
Hi. Can you hear me okay?
I was just letting Abby know next there was somebody there who had their hand
okay,
up.
great. I was just gonna, it is subtle. You can't really hear yourself.
I can hear you.
Okay,
but
good.
you can-
Just wanted to give a shout out to some of the Los Angeles-based Black image collectors, like my father, Alden Kimbrough, who used to own Zambezi Bazaar, which was right here. Alden used to buy from me after my father died, so did maybe Clayton. You know, I think about all these. I just looked up Alden. If he's alive, he's 86, right? So I was young, you know, providing some of my ephemera to some other folks. But I think about background, but like all these images, like I wonder what happened to them, right? Because like you talked about how images, like nobody values it like you do, you know. So does the Kimbrough family have those images? You know, what's going on with them? There's an article, if anybody, it's in the Sentinel, and Jackie talks about if you ever went to Zambezi Bazaar, which was, I think, next door. So when you think about all this ephemera, I would love to see like some of these things found, perhaps, or even, I guess, just preserved, or just somebody to contact them. I can contact him. But when I think about like what all these things that were captured, it's just a shame if we don't do what you're talking about and pull them in some ways. So, and LA's
thank
the
you.
5th largest Black population in the country. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. There is a young man over here who had his hand up like for a while.
Can you hear me?
Louder.
Test. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, first want to say thank you all for having this conversation and sharing your experiences and the process behind curating a show like this. Can't wait to see it. I have a bit of a two-part question. So I'm working on a project right now where trying to get the former home of Etta James nominated as a cultural monument. And so we're trying to get participation from community members, many who are elders. And so when asking for pictures and stuff like that, they kind of, they don't think their, photos or whatever are important to the project. So my question is, what would you say to, community members whose histories and stories are important but don't see the value in it themselves? And then my second question is, in regard to the photos that had got thrown out like 3 days before, was there any attempts to like go to the city dump and like say, hey, look out for a red box with photos or something? Like just curious about that.
My understanding, no, and I don't think you know how trash collection happens in Houston. Is if it's gone, it's gone. Yeah, but I think what you're asking, important question, and I think what I would say is, if I were building a community-based photo collection, I wouldn't go in and ask people for their images immediately, because think about your experience with photography. My family photos are very precious to me. I'm not even going to give them to a distant relative. I took some photographs from my mom 2 weeks ago, and I was like, I'm going to take good care of it. My mom trusts me, but it's like, it's also that's a precious thing to do. It feels different, I think, for younger people, because so much of what they take is on their camera, right? But I think that's maybe 2 decades at most. Most people, it's very precious. And often when, for example, when there's a house fire, people would say that losing the photographs was the most important thing for them. But that was to them what was completely irreplaceable. So I think especially elders might have a different kind of relationship with those images. So the first thing I wouldn't ask is, can I borrow your photographs? I think it's kind of your job to establish why you're showing up and what you're doing is important, and hopefully build connection there, that they start seeing the importance of what you're doing. You got to start there, I think, with that kind of common ground of having a shared experience and a shared sense of values.
And it takes time. This thing can't be microwaved. You need to build trust. You need to build all the kinds of things that says that, you know, if people have been keeping pictures of Etta James or whoever for this many years, for someone new to come in and say, well, can we share your pictures? Well, there are all kinds of things that, you know, in between there, or who are you? And so you need to sort of, and that's a very unpopular thing, that it takes time, but it takes time. It could take 10 years.
And it's important I wrote in my first book that I wrote, it's called Troubling Vision. I wrote about a photographer in Pittsburgh, and it still breaks my heart to think of his story. His name is Charles Teeny Harris. He was like many of the photographers in this exhibition. He was a community photographer. And I am not exaggerating when I say he built the largest individual collection of one single neighborhood in the entire world. He spent his entire life photographing the Hill District where he lived in Pittsburgh, and when he died, he had over 100,000 negatives over 6 decades in his community. And he died very poor. He had worked for the black press. He had celebrity photos. There's not any insurance for an independent working community photographer. So by the time he's in his, he lived very long, but by the time he was in his 80s, he's very destitute, poor. He's still living in a home. He has his archives in his house. And an entrepreneur, a black man, said, hey, I'm going to help you make money. I'm going to help you publish create some catalogs. And he ran off with his collection. So this is why you don't want to do this, right? And there was legal battles, and I'm pretty sure, I wrote this article many, many years ago, but I'm pretty sure he died before the collection returned to him. It was his son who had to continue to fight to get that. So, anything black people have possessed in our 5 centuries of being on this continent has been taken from us, or people have attempted to take it from us. So I would not, if you look like a very kind person and started asking me to give you photographs, I would say you're very kind and you're a handsome young person, and no. no, thank you.
Thank you all so much. Can we give another round of applause for Nicole and LeRonn? Thank you.